The date is October 31st, 1838, a moonless, suffocatingly dark night in the remote foothills of the Virginia Appalachians. Outside the small, solitary courthouse of Blackwood Creek County, a crowd of townsfolk stands frozen, their faces pale and slick in the flickering torchlight. They are listening. Every man, woman, and child is straining to hear past the thick oak of the courthouse doors, listening to the silence that has descended like a burial shroud. Just moments before, that silence had been violently torn apart. It was not the sound of a struggle, nor the report of a pistol. It was the sound of a single, piercing scream, a razor-thin shriek of absolute, soul-shattering terror that had erupted from within the sealed building before being abruptly choked off. Now there is nothing. A quiet so profound, so unnatural, it feels heavier and more menacing than any noise could ever be. The air is cold, but the people gathered there are sweating. They stare at the courthouse doors, knowing that inside are the most prominent members of their community: the judge, the jury, the lawyers, and every single witness in the most disturbing murder trial the county has ever seen. They also know something else, something that defies all logic and reason. The heavy crossbar on the door was just heard dropping into its iron brackets. From the inside, they are not just locked in, they have been sealed in. The horrifying truth has not yet dawned on them, but they are standing vigil at the edge of a mass grave, witnesses to an event so macabre and impossible that it would be deliberately erased from history, a cold case that was banned from all official records. They are listening for a sign of life from a room that has just become a tomb. The Blackwood Creek Courthouse was not an imposing structure. It was a simple, stout building of local stone and timber, built to project an image of frontier justice, solid, unyielding, and clear. But on this night it seemed to have transformed. The shadows cast by the torches writhed and clung to its walls like living things. The two front doors, fashioned from ancient oak trees felled on the very land the county was named for, now looked less like an entrance and more like a mausoleum seal. Sheriff Miller, a man whose courage had never been questioned, put his shoulder to the wood. It didn't budge. He and three other men threw their combined weight against it, their grunts of effort swallowed by the oppressive silence. The wood groaned, but the heavy bar on the other side held fast. A low murmur of panic began to ripple through the crowd. Women clutched their children, pulling them back from the building as if its very presence were a contagion. Inside that room were nearly 30 souls. 30 people who had walked in that morning to see justice done, now trapped in a horrifying, soundless void. What could cause such a scream, followed by such an absolute absence of noise? Had the accused, the outcast Silas Blackwood, broken free? Had he somehow overpowered the bailiffs and begun a massacre? It was a terrifying thought, but it was a human thought. It was a scenario they could, on some level, comprehend. What they could not comprehend was the feeling that was beginning to seep out from under the courthouse doors, a palpable aura of dread, ancient and predatory. It was a feeling that suggested the horror inside was not a human one. The horrifying mystery of the Blackwood Creek Courthouse had just begun, and the truth of what happened in that sealed room was infinitely more disturbing than any simple slaughter. To understand the events of that night, one must first understand Blackwood Creek County itself. In 1838, it was little more than a whisper on the map of Virginia, a rugged, isolated pocket of the world carved out of the dense, primeval forests of the Appalachian Mountains. It was a place where progress moved at a glacial pace, and old ways, older fears, clung to the hollows and shadowed valleys like the persistent morning fog. The people here were hardy and self-reliant, their lives dictated by the seasons and the unforgiving nature of the land. They were deeply suspicious of outsiders, and even more so of the secrets the land itself seemed to hold. The forests were ancient, filled with towering pines and oaks that had stood long before any European settlers had set foot there. These were not welcoming woods. They were dark, labyrinthine, and according to local folklore, haunted. Generations of children were hushed with tales of things that dwelled deep within the woods, things that watched from between the trees with unseen eyes. These were more than just ghost stories. They were cautionary tales, a collective memory of the grim fates that had befallen those who strayed too far from the beaten path or showed disrespect to the old, unspoken rules of the wilderness. This was a community built on a fragile truce with the vast, untamed nature that surrounded them. And it was this fragile peace that had been shattered by a crime so brutal. It seemed to have been clawed up from the very soil itself, dragging the community's darkest superstitions into the horrifying light of day. The crime that had brought the county to a standstill was the murder of Thomas Preston. He was not just any young man. He was the only son of John Preston, the founder of the county and its wealthiest, most powerful citizen. Thomas was found in a small clearing deep in the Blackwood Forest, a place known to locals as the Whisperwood, and for good reason. The scene was macabre beyond description. His body had been subjected to a level of violence that spoke of something far beyond mere human rage. Dr. Arlen Crane, the county physician, would later testify that the wounds were precise, almost surgical, yet inflicted with a savage force that had shattered bone. But it was the other details that had truly sown terror in the hearts of the community. Strange, spiraling symbols were painted on the surrounding trees in the victim's own blood. His heart had been removed with an unnatural, chilling precision. There was no sign of a struggle, as if the young man had simply laid down and accepted his horrifying fate. This was not a murder of passion or robbery. The townsfolk, raised on whispers of dark folklore, immediately recognized it for what it was: a ritual, a sacrifice. It was an act of forbidden heresy, a profound violation of the natural order that struck at the very heart of their fragile, God-fearing community. They needed a culprit, a monster to blame, and their fearful eyes turned unanimously to the one man who lived near the Whisperwood, a man already condemned by rumor and suspicion long before the body was ever found. His name was Silas Blackwood. He was the last of his line, a reclusive and unsettling figure who inhabited a dilapidated cabin on a tract of land that his family had owned for generations, land that bordered the darkest, most avoided part of the forest. The Blackwoods had always been outsiders. Whispers followed them like their own shadows, tales of strange traditions, of consorting with things best left alone. They were said to practice old-world folk magic, to know the secrets of the woods, and to pay respects to forces far older than the Christian God the rest of the county worshipped. Silas, more than any of his ancestors, embodied this unnerving reputation. He was rarely seen in town, and when he was, his presence was a disquieting one. He was tall and gaunt, with eyes so dark they seemed to swallow the light. He never spoke unless spoken to, and his silence was more intimidating than any threat. He was a man who seemed to belong more to the shadows of the forest than to the world of men. So when the body of Thomas Preston was discovered on land that was practically his doorstep, marked with the kind of ritualistic savagery that echoed the darkest local legends, the community did not need evidence. They had their scapegoat. They had their monster. In their minds, Silas Blackwood was not just a murderer. He was the horrifying embodiment of all the ancient, forbidden evils they feared lurked in the deep woods, and they were determined to see him brought to justice, no matter the cost. The arrest of Silas Blackwood was an event that quickly became local legend. Sheriff Miller, a pragmatic man not given to flights of fancy, gathered a posse of a dozen armed and anxious men. As they rode towards Silas's property, the forest seemed to grow darker, the air colder. The sounds of birds and insects ceased, leaving only the unnerving crunch of leaves under their horses' hooves. They found Silas sitting on the porch of his decrepit cabin, calmly carving a piece of wood. He did not look up as the posse surrounded him, their rifles trained on his chest. He showed no fear, no surprise. It was as if he had been waiting for them. Sheriff Miller read the charge of murder, his voice sounding thin and uncertain in the heavy silence. Silas simply set down his carving and stood, offering his wrists to be bound without a word. It was inside the cabin that the men's fear began to curdle into genuine terror. The single room was filled with bizarre artifacts: bundles of raven feathers tied with horsehair, bowls of dried herbs and teeth from unknown animals, and most disturbingly, dozens of wooden totems carved into unsettling, non-human shapes. And on the far wall, painted in what looked like dried blood, was the same spiraling symbol found at the murder scene. It was a macabre confirmation of their deepest fears. Yet Silas's calm was absolute. As they led him away, he looked back not at his cabin but at the dark tree line, a faint, unreadable smile on his lips. This was not the behavior of a guilty man caught, but of a zealot whose work was just beginning. And so, the stage was set for the trial that would doom them all. The Blackwood Creek Courthouse became the focal point of the entire region. People came from neighboring counties, drawn by the horrifying, lurid details of the crime and the dark reputation of the accused. The small building was filled to capacity on the morning of October 31st. The air inside was thick with a cocktail of morbid curiosity, grief, and pure, unadulterated hatred. Judge Alastair Finch, a stern and respected magistrate from Richmond, was brought in to preside over the case, ensuring that justice would be swift and severe. The prosecution had a roster of key witnesses, each one a pillar of the community, each one ready to provide a nail for Silas Blackwood's coffin. There was John Preston, the powerful and grieving father, whose testimony alone could sway any jury. There was Dr. Arlen Crane, the man of science, who would detail the unspeakable ritualistic nature of the murder. There was Gideon Lee, the humble farmer who had made the grisly discovery and had seen a shadowy figure in the woods. And there were others, each with a small piece of the puzzle that would condemn the silent man in the defendant's box. Every person who took the witness stand that day believed they were serving the cause of justice. They had no way of knowing they were not testifying at a trial. They were registering their names for a reaping. Their fates, and the fate of everyone in that room, had already been sealed. The trial began under the grim light of a gray autumn morning. The interior of the courthouse was somber and oppressive. Dark wood panels, worn smooth by years of frontier disputes, seemed to absorb the weak light that filtered through the tall, grimy windows. The room was packed shoulder to shoulder, the collective body heat doing little to dispel the unnatural chill that lingered in the air. Judge Alastair Finch sat elevated, a figure of imposing authority, his face a grim mask of judicial certainty. The jury, 12 local men, farmers, merchants, a blacksmith, sat with hardened expressions, their minds already made up. All eyes, however, were on the accused. Silas Blackwood sat beside his court-appointed lawyer, a nervous young man from out of town who looked as if he would rather be anywhere else. Silas himself was a portrait of eerie stillness. He was not shackled, yet he did not move a muscle, his gaunt frame draped in worn, dark clothing. His gaze was not directed at the judge, the jury, or his accusers. It was fixed on a point somewhere on the back wall of the courthouse, as if he were observing a guest that no one else could see. The prosecutor began his opening statement, his voice booming with righteous fury, painting a picture of a diabolical, cold-blooded killer who had preyed upon the innocents of their community. The crowd murmured in agreement, their hostility a palpable force in the room. This was not to be a trial, it was to be a condemnation, a ritual of a different sort. Our only window into the horrifying events that unfolded within those sealed walls comes from a single, forbidden source, the personal journal of a young court clerk named Elias Vance. Elias was a quiet, meticulous man, known for his beautiful penmanship and his observant nature. His journal, discovered nearly a century later hidden beneath the floorboards of a derelict cabin miles from the courthouse, was not an official record. It was a private, terrified account of the day's proceedings, written with a hand that grew increasingly shaky as the hours wore on. His entries from that morning begin with descriptions of the oppressive atmosphere. He writes, "There is a sickness in the air of this room. It is not the mere tension of a murder trial, but something heavier, something ancient. It feels as if the very stones of this building are watching and waiting." Elias, in his role as clerk, was positioned with a clear view of every participant. He saw the hatred in the eyes of the townsfolk, the feigned confidence of the lawyers, the stern resolve of the judge. But most of all, he saw Silas Blackwood, and what he saw, or rather, what he felt when he looked at him, filled him with a sense of profound, inexplicable dread that had nothing to do with the murder of Thomas Preston. His journal would become the only testament to the truth, a chilling narrative of escalating terror that documented, moment by moment, the courthouse's descent into madness. The first witness called to the stand was John Preston, the victim's father. A man of immense local power and influence, he was now a broken figure, his face a roadmap of grief and fury. He spoke of his son's bright future, of the love he had for his family and his community. His voice, thick with emotion, held the courtroom captive. He pointed a trembling finger at Silas Blackwood. "That creature," he spat, "took my only boy. He is a blight upon this land, a servant of evil who has consorted with the devil in those dark woods since the day he was born. He must be purged." The sentiment was met with a chorus of grim agreement. But Elias Vance, watching from his clerk's desk, noted something deeply strange in his journal. While Preston's words were aimed at Silas, his eyes kept darting away, flicking towards the shadowed corners of the room, towards the high-ceiling rafters shrouded in gloom. It was not the behavior of a man confronting his son's killer. It was the furtive, terrified glancing of a man who fears he is being watched by something else entirely. Elias wrote, "Mr. Preston speaks with hatred, but his eyes hold only fear. It is as if he knows another, greater evil is present, and in condemning Mr. Blackwood, he fears he may be inviting its attention upon himself." The testimony, meant to establish Silas's guilt, had instead introduced a new, unseen character into the horrifying drama, a lurking, invisible presence. Next to the stand was Dr. Arlen Crane. A man of science and logic, Dr. Crane was expected to provide a clinical, factual account of the murder. But as he began to speak, his scientific detachment crumbled, replaced by a tone of professional horror. He described the wounds with a quavering voice, explaining that they were not made by any knife or tool he had ever seen. The incisions were too clean, the force too great. He spoke of the chillingly precise removal of the heart, an act that would have required immense skill and a complete lack of human empathy. Then he delivered the statement that sent a wave of cold dread through the courtroom. "In my considered medical opinion," he said, his voice barely a whisper, "the state of the body, the nature of the wounds, they are not consistent with the actions of a man. They are unholy." The word hung in the air, a secular man's confession of a supernatural truth. The jury shifted uncomfortably. The crowd fell silent. The word unholy gave a name to the formless fear that had gripped the county. This wasn't just a crime, it was a desecration. It was in this moment of chilling revelation that the line between justice and superstition began to blur into a terrifying gray. The mysteries of our world are often buried in forbidden histories like this one, and if you wish to unearth more of them with us, consider subscribing to our channel. Because the testimony that follows drags this trial even deeper into the macabre. It was as Dr. Crane spoke the word unholy that the first overtly supernatural event occurred. Elias Vance's journal documents it with meticulous, terrified detail. The day was overcast and windless, the windows of the courthouse sealed shut against the autumn chill. Yet at that exact moment, every single tallow candle in the room's iron chandeliers flickered in perfect, impossible unison. The flames dipped low, turning a sickly blue, before flaring up to twice their normal height. For a few heartbeats, the room was cast in a manic, dancing light. Shadows writhed and stretched, transforming the familiar faces of the townsfolk into grotesque, monstrous masks. The shadow of Judge Finch on the wall behind him ballooned into a horned, demonic shape. The shadow of Silas Blackwood, however, did something far more disturbing. It did not move. It did not flicker or stretch. It simply seemed to deepen, becoming a patch of absolute, absorbing blackness, a void in the shape of a man. The phenomenon lasted only a few seconds before the flames returned to normal, but the effect was profound. A collective gasp swept through the room. People looked around in confusion and fear, seeking a rational explanation that did not exist. There was no draft. There was no wind. It was, as Elias wrote, a shared hallucination, a silent scream from the world of spirits, warning us to proceed no further. But the warning went unheeded. The trial, now tainted by a chilling, inexplicable omen continued. The prosecution's third key witness was Gideon Lee, the farmer who had stumbled upon the horrifying scene in the Whisperwood. He was a simple, God-fearing man, and taking the stand was clearly an ordeal for him. His face was pale, his hands trembling as he swore his oath on the Bible. He recounted how his dog had led him off the path, whining and agitated, towards the clearing. He described the moment he first saw Thomas Preston's body, a sight so ghastly he had turned and retched. But it was what he said next that captured the courtroom's full, horrified attention. The prosecutor asked him if he'd seen anyone in the area in the days leading up to the murder. Gideon hesitated, swallowing hard. Not a man, exactly," he stammered, his eyes wide with remembered fear. "A few nights before, I was checking my fences near the woods. I saw something moving between the trees. It was tall, the shape of a man, but it was made of shadow. Like the dark between the branches had come to life. It didn't walk, it flowed." He then added that he had heard whispers on the wind, a sibilant, overlapping chorus of voices speaking a language he did not understand. The courtroom was utterly silent, hanging on his every word. Gideon Lee was not describing Silas Blackwood. He was describing, with terrifying sincerity, the very creature from the county's most forbidden folklore. The ghost story had just walked into the courtroom and taken a seat. Through all this escalating testimony, the grieving father, the horrified doctor, the terrified farmer, Silas Blackwood remained a statue of unnerving calm. He did not flinch, he did not react. He simply watched the back wall of the courthouse with a placid, almost devotional intensity. The performance was maddening. A guilty man would show anger or fear. An innocent man would show outrage. Silas showed nothing but a serene and patient anticipation. Elias Vance's journal becomes fixated on this detail. He wrote, "All the hatred in this room is directed at him, a storm of emotion that would break any normal man. Yet he seems not to feel it. He is a rock in a raging river, untouched by the current. Or perhaps he is not the rock but the anchor, holding us all in place for something else." The court-appointed lawyer tried to speak with him, leaning in to whisper in his ear, but Silas offered no response. He was there in body, but his mind, his spirit, seemed to be elsewhere, communing with the unseen presence he was so intently focused on. His silence was becoming more terrifying than any confession. It was the silence of a man who knows the outcome, a man who is not a participant in the trial, but its master of ceremonies. He was not on trial for his life. He was presiding over the end of theirs. The testimony of Gideon Lee had unlocked a dark corner of the collective psyche of Blackwood Creek. Suddenly, the old stories, the ones told in hushed tones around winter fires, felt chillingly relevant. The most prominent of these was the legend of the Whispering Shadow, or as older generations called it, the Hollow Pine Entity. The tale was ancient, predating the first white settlers, allegedly adapted from the warnings of the native tribes who had long ago abandoned the area. The legend spoke of a timeless, hungry being that dwelled in the oldest, deepest parts of the forest. It was not a ghost or a demon in the Christian sense, but something more elemental, a genius loci of the land itself, and its nature was predatory. The entity, the stories claimed, was a silent guardian of the woods, and it demanded tribute. It was said that in generations past, certain isolated families living on the edge of its domain, families like the Blackwoods, had entered into a dark pact with the creature. They would be granted protection, and the land would yield its secrets to them, but in return, they had to provide the entity with occasional sacrifices. These tales were always dismissed as macabre folklore, a way to explain the harsh realities of frontier life where people sometimes simply vanished. But now, in the chilling context of Thomas Preston's ritualistic murder and Silas Blackwood's unnerving calm, the forbidden folklore seemed like a horrifyingly plausible instruction manual for the events that were unfolding. The prosecutor, a man named Sterling, brought his case to a close. He had presented a powerful, if circumstantial, narrative. He had a brutal, ritualistic murder. He had a suspect who lived at the scene of the crime, whose home was filled with macabre artifacts and occult symbols matching those at the scene. He had a man who showed no remorse, no emotion, and offered no alibi. In his closing remarks, he thundered that Silas Blackwood was a cancer on their community, a practitioner of forbidden arts who had committed an unspeakable act. "He has invited the devil into our woods," Sterling declared, his voice echoing in the tense silence, "and we must send him back to hell." The sentiment was clear. The jury was already convinced. A conviction was a foregone conclusion. Judge Finch, his face grim, turned his attention to the defendant's table. He looked past the pale-faced lawyer and addressed Silas directly. "Mr. Blackwood," the judge's voice was cold and hard, "you have heard the testimony against you. The evidence of your guilt is substantial. Do you have anything to say in your own defense before this court proceeds to judgment?" For the first time all day, Silas Blackwood moved. He slowly turned his head, breaking his long, silent vigil with the back wall, and swept his dark, hollow eyes over every person in the room. When Silas Blackwood finally spoke, his voice was a dry, rasping sound, like dead leaves skittering across stone. It was a voice unused to conversation, honed instead for whispers in the dark woods. The entire courtroom held its breath, straining to hear the madman's confession or an innocent man's desperate plea. He offered neither. Looking directly at Judge Finch, but speaking to the room as a whole, he said two sentences that would forever be seared into the memory of the only survivor. "The debt is paid," he rasped, a faint, chilling smile touching his lips. Then his eyes unfocused, looking back towards the wall behind the judge's bench. "The final witness is coming." A wave of confusion and revulsion swept through the crowd. The words were meaningless, yet they felt heavy with a horrifying, cryptic significance. The debt? What debt? And who was this final witness? The prosecution had rested its case. There were no more witnesses to call. The statement was dismissed as the nonsensical raving of a disturbed mind. The judge slammed his gavel, his patience clearly at an end, calling for order. He was about to instruct the jury to begin their deliberation when a commotion erupted from the back of the courtroom. The final, horrifying act of the trial was about to begin, and it had been summoned not by the court, but by Silas Blackwood himself. A young woman fought her way through the crowd, her face streaked with tears, her eyes wide with a mixture of terror and desperate resolve. It was Sarah Kane, a girl from a modest family known for her quiet demeanor. It was an open secret in the town that she and the murdered Thomas Preston had been courting against the wishes of his powerful father. "Wait," she cried out, her voice trembling but clear. "You have to listen to me. You're wrong. It was Silas." The courtroom erupted into chaos. John Preston rose to his feet, his face purple with rage, demanding the girl be silenced. Judge Finch hammered his gavel, his shouts for order barely audible over the din. Sarah, however, was resolute. She pushed her way to the front, her eyes fixed on the judge. "I have to testify," she pleaded. "I was with Thomas the night he died. I know what happened. I know who or what he went to meet." This was a shocking, unexpected turn. A new witness, one who could potentially exonerate Silas Blackwood. The prosecutor looked furious, his perfect case suddenly thrown into jeopardy. Judge Finch, for all his stern authority, was a man of the law. Reluctantly, he knew he had to allow it. He silenced the room with a final, booming crack of his gavel and motioned for Sarah to approach the witness stand. As she walked, every eye was on her except for Silas Blackwood. His gaze remained fixed on the back wall, his faint, horrifying smile widening ever so slightly. The final witness had arrived. It was at this moment that Elias Vance, the young clerk, was overcome by a sudden and overwhelming sense of physical illness. In his journal, he struggles to describe the sensation. It was not a simple nausea or a dizzy spell. It was a profound spiritual sickness, a feeling of absolute, soul-crushing dread that seemed to radiate from the very foundations of the building. He wrote, "A presence made itself known in the room." It was not a ghost or a spirit, but a tangible thing, an entity of immense and ancient malice. The air grew thick and cold, smelling of damp earth and rot. My heart hammered in my chest, and a primal, animal terror seized me. I felt as if a great predator had just entered the room, and we were all, every one of us, its cornered prey. He looked at Sarah taking the stand, at the expectant faces of the jury, at the impatient judge, and he was overcome with the horrifying certainty that they were all about to die. He could not explain the feeling, but it was as real to him as the wooden desk beneath his trembling hands. Faking a sudden fever and a violent coughing fit, he begged the bailiff to let him appeal to the judge. Judge Finch, annoyed by the interruption but preoccupied with the new witness, saw the sweat on the young man's brow and curtly waved him away. "Go," he ordered. "Be gone with you." And with that simple, irritated command, Judge Finch unknowingly saved Elias Vance's life. Elias stumbled through the side door of the clerk's office, his legs weak beneath him. He pushed his way past the inner door and finally emerged into the fatting daylight of the late afternoon. The cold, fresh air was a shock to his system, a relief from the suffocating, malevolent atmosphere inside. He leaned against the rough stone of the outer courthouse wall, gasping for breath, his heart still pounding in his chest. He felt like a man who had just escaped a burning building. The murmurs of the crowd gathered outside seemed distant, dreamlike. He looked back at the heavy oak doors he had just exited, a profound sense of guilt and fear washing over him. He had abandoned his post. He had fled, but the instinct to survive had been too powerful to ignore. As he stood there catching his breath, he heard the proceedings resume inside. He heard the bailiff's voice, faint through the thick walls, swearing in the new witness. He heard Sarah Kane begin to speak, her voice thin and reedy. And then he heard the scream. It was the same scream we began our story with, the one that had ripped through the silence of the night, a sound of pure, unadulterated horror. Elias Vance, the lone survivor, was now the only witness to the courthouse's final, horrifying moments. He was the last person to ever leave that room alive. The scream that tore from Sarah Kane's lungs was not a sound of human fear. It was the shriek of a soul looking directly into the abyss. Elias, standing just outside, flinched as if struck. The sound was horribly amplified, yet simultaneously muffled by the stone walls as if he were hearing it through water. It climbed to an impossible, razor-sharp pitch and then was suddenly, brutally cut off. For a single, heart-stopping moment, there was absolute silence. And then came a new sound, a sound that would haunt Elias' nightmares for the rest of his short life. It was a deafening, earth-shaking boom. It was the sound of the massive oak doors of the courthouse slamming shut with the force of a cannon blast. Elias stared in disbelief. No human could have closed those doors with such violence. It was as if the building itself had snapped its jaws shut. Then came a sound that defied all physical law, a sound that confirmed the horror was now absolute and inescapable. It was the heavy, final thud of the immense wooden crossbar falling into its iron brackets, locking the doors. From the inside, the screams began again, this time not just from one person, but from many. A chorus of terrified, desperate cries erupted from within the courthouse, a symphony of sheer panic from 30 trapped souls. The horrifying mystery had reached its point of no return. Panic erupted among the townsfolk outside. The violent slam of the doors and the sound of the internal bar sent a shockwave of terror through the crowd. Men shouted and women screamed, surging forward towards the courthouse before recoiling as if from a hot stove. Sheriff Miller, who had been trying to maintain order in the square, drew his pistol and ran to the doors, his face a mask of grim confusion. He pounded his fist on the solid oak. "Open these doors. In the name of the law, open these doors." His only answer was the cacophony of terrified screams from within. He and the other men resumed their frantic efforts to break down the doors, throwing their shoulders against the unyielding wood, using a felled log as a makeshift battering ram. But it was useless. The doors, which just that morning had been a simple entrance to a place of law, had become an impenetrable barrier. It felt as if they were not trying to break into a building, but into the belly of some great stone beast. It was an impossible situation, a horrifying paradox. How could the doors be barred from within? Who had done it? The rational mind searched for an explanation, that Silas's followers had somehow snuck in, but the primal fear in their hearts knew the truth was far more sinister. The courthouse was no longer just a building. It had become an active participant in the horror. It was holding them captive. The sounds that began to emanate from the courthouse were what truly broke the sanity of those listening outside. Elias Vance, crouched by the wall in abject terror, describes them in his journal with fragmented, almost incoherent prose. It was not, he wrote, the sound of a human massacre. There were no gunshots, no sounds of a struggle, no clash of blades. What he heard was infinitely more macabre. He describes a series of wet, tearing noises, punctuated by the sickening, percussive crunch of breaking bone. Over this horrifying bass rhythm were the screams, choked, gurgling cries that were cut short one by one. It was a methodical sound, organized. It was, Elias wrote with a hand shaking so badly his letters were nearly illegible, the sound of a harvest. He compared it to the noises one might hear in a slaughterhouse, but magnified, distorted, and applied to human beings. The most disturbing aspect was the lack of any aggressor's voice. There were no guttural roars, no maniacal laughter, no shouted commands. There was only the sound of the victims and the grisly, industrial process of their consumption. The people outside, hearing these unthinkable noises, fell into a stunned, horrified silence. They were listening to their friends and family, the leaders of their community, being systematically, audibly, and inexplicably disassembled. Then, as suddenly as it began, the horror ceased. After perhaps 10 minutes of the most terrifying sounds imaginable, the courthouse fell into a silence so deep and unnatural it was somehow more frightening than the preceding chaos. The last choked-off scream faded, leaving nothing but the sound of the wind in the trees and the ragged, terrified breathing of the crowd. The silence was absolute. It was a dead silence, the quiet of a tomb. The townsfolk stood frozen, their faces illuminated by the dying torchlight, looking at the stone building that had just swallowed 30 of their own. They waited, they watched, they prayed. They expected the doors to be thrown open for a blood-soaked Silas Blackwood to emerge, laughing maniacally. They expected a fire to break out. They expected something, anything, to break the awful, profound stillness. But nothing happened. The courthouse just stood there, a dark, silent monolith against the night sky. The night dragged on, each minute an eternity. The crowd thinned as terrified families retreated to their homes, barring their doors and shuttering their windows. But a small, brave contingent, including Sheriff Miller and Elias Vance, remained. They kept a grim, silent vigil through the longest night of their lives, waiting for a dawn that they prayed would bring answers, but which they feared would only confirm their most horrifying, unspeakable dread. The dawn of November 1st, 1838, broke cold and gray over Blackwood Creek County. The rising sun did little to dispel the gloom that hung over the town square. It only served to illuminate the grim, silent reality of the courthouse. It stood there, unharmed, looking just as it had the day before, yet everyone knew it was now a place of profound and terrible wrongness. Word had spread through the night, and a posse of grim-faced men, armed with axes and crowbars, had arrived from the neighboring county of Silver Creek. They had heard the wild, unbelievable rumors and had come to offer aid. Sheriff Miller, his face gaunt from a sleepless night of terror, directed them to the doors. With renewed determination, the men set to work. The sound of their axes striking the ancient oak echoed through the unnervingly quiet town. It took them the better part of an hour, the wood splintering and groaning in protest, before they finally managed to smash through the heavy crossbar. With one final, concerted effort, the doors scraped open, revealing the darkness within. The men stood back, breathing heavily, their axes held ready, expecting to be met with a scene of unimaginable carnage. The story of what happened next is the reason this horrifying cold case was deliberately banned from official records. And if you're finding this descent into a forbidden mystery compelling, please support our work by liking this video. It helps us continue to uncover the darkest chapters of history that have been intentionally forgotten. Sheriff Miller, pistol drawn, was the first to step across the threshold. The other men followed, their boots crunching on the splinters of the broken door. The interior of the courthouse was dark and still, shafts of dusty gray light from the tall windows piercing the gloom. As their eyes adjusted, a collective, disbelieving silence fell over the posse. They had been prepared for a bloodbath. They had steeled themselves for a scene of grotesque, ritualistic slaughter. What they found was something far more disturbing, something that defied all known laws of the universe. The room was empty, not just empty of bodies, it was pristine. The long benches for the spectators were in their neat rows. The jury box was undisturbed. The prosecutors' and defenders' tables were exactly as they had been left. The law books sat on their shelves, the candles in their chandeliers. There was no blood on the floor. There were no signs of a struggle. There was no evidence that anything violent, or indeed anything at all, had happened. 30 people, Judge Finch, the 12 jurymen, the lawyers, the bailiffs, Sarah Kane, John Preston, Dr. Crane, Gideon Lee, and Silas Blackwood himself, had vanished into thin air from inside a room that had been sealed from within. It was a horrifying, logic-defying impossibility. It was as if the trial and everyone involved in it had never existed at all. The men spread out, their footsteps echoing unnervingly in the silent room. They were searching for a clue, a rational explanation for the impossible scene before them. A trapdoor, a hidden passage. They checked the floors, the walls, the very stones of the foundation. They found nothing. The courthouse was as solid and simple as it appeared. It was a sealed stone box. There was no way in and no way out other than the doors they had just broken down. It was then that one of the deputies from Silver Creek called out, his voice a choked whisper. All eyes turned to the judge's bench at the front of the room. There, carved deep into the dark wood of the elevated bench where Judge Finch had sat in judgment, was a single macabre mark that had not been there the day before. It was a spiraling, intricate symbol, a vortex of lines that seemed to twist and writhe, creating an optical illusion that was both nauseating and strangely mesmerizing. It hurt the eyes to look at it directly, a shape that felt alien and wrong, a piece of non-Euclidean geometry forced into their reality. Sheriff Miller recognized it instantly. It was the same disturbing symbol they had found painted on the trees in the Whisperwood, the same forbidden sigil that had adorned the wall of Silas Blackwood's cabin. It was the only thing left behind, the sole piece of evidence from an impossible crime. The aftermath of the vanishing was the death of Blackwood Creek County itself. The event was too traumatic, too fundamentally world-breaking, for the community to survive. How can you continue your life when you know that 30 people can simply cease to exist inside a locked room? The official investigation, led by state authorities from Richmond, was a farce. Faced with an event that defied all rational explanation, they chose to invent one. The official report, which was quickly classified and banned from public access, claimed that a flash fire fueled by lantern oil had consumed everyone inside, leaving no remains. It was a ludicrous lie, but it was a comfortable one. It was a story that allowed the world to keep making sense. But the people of Blackwood Creek knew better. They had stood outside and listened. They knew there was no fire. They knew the truth was something far more horrifying. They began to leave, first as a trickle, then as a flood. They abandoned their homes, their farms, their lives, fleeing the cursed land and the silent, empty courthouse that stood as a monument to their terror. Within a decade, Blackwood Creek County was a ghost town, its buildings slowly being reclaimed by the dark, whispering forest that surrounded it. The horrifying mystery was not solved. It was simply abandoned, left to fester in the shadows of the mountains. We now return to the source of our story, the journal of Elias Vance, discovered nearly 100 years later by a timber surveyor. The final pages are not the writings of a rational man. They are the feverish, desperate scrawls of a mind shattered by proximity to an incomprehensible horror. In the days and weeks following the vanishing, Elias did not flee. He hid, obsessed, trying to make sense of what he had witnessed. His later entries reveal a horrifying new detail. He claimed that the sickness he felt in the courthouse was not just a feeling of dread, but a psychic connection. He believes that in his panic state, his mind was somehow opened, and he didn't just hear the events inside the courthouse. In his mind's eye, he saw them. He writes of a fractured, nightmarish vision, a collage of impossible images that his brain could barely process. He describes the moment Sarah Kane took the stand, not with words, but with crude, shaky sketches in the margins of the journal. In the drawings, Sarah is not pointing at Silas. She is pointing past him, her face a mask of ultimate terror, at the wall behind the judge's bench. And in his final, most disturbing drawing, the wall is no longer there. Here we arrive at the horrifying climax of our story, the forbidden truth hidden in the last pages of a madman's journal. This is the revelation that explains the impossible vanishing. According to Elias Vance's final, terrifying entry when Sarah Kane screamed, it was because the wall behind Judge Finch had begun to change. It did not crumble or break. It dissolved. The stone and plaster, he wrote, rippled like dark water and then peeled back, not revealing the forest outside, but opening into a realm of absolute living darkness. It was not a hole or a portal, it was a mouth. A doorway, Elias scrawled, made of teeth and shadow. From this impossible aperture, a presence poured into the room. He struggles to describe it using contradictory terms. A great shadow, a being of living cold, a sound that was also a color. It had no definitive shape, but it had a palpable, overwhelming hunger. The room, he realized, had not just been sealed. It had become a cage, a feeding pen, and the people inside were the livestock. The horrifying truth had finally dawned on him, a truth so monstrous it could barely be put into words. Silas Blackwood was not the murderer, he was the priest. Thomas Preston had not been a victim of random violence, he had been a carefully chosen sacrifice. His death was not the crime itself, but the key, the offering required to unlock the door between worlds and summon the whispering shadow. And the trial was the most diabolical part of the entire plan. It was the banquet. Silas knew that the brutal nature of his offering would guarantee a public trial. He knew it would gather all the pillars of the community, the law, the science, the wealth, the common man, all the witnesses, into a single consecrated space. His cryptic words finally made sense. "The debt is paid," he had said, referring to the blood sacrifice of Thomas Preston. "The final witness is coming," he had promised, referring not to Sarah Kane, but to the ancient, hungry entity he served. He had used the town's own system of justice as a tool to gather his final, grand offering. He had turned the courthouse into a larder, and he had just called the master of the house to dinner. Elias Vance's last coherent entry is a single, chilling paragraph that reframes the entire horrifying mystery. He finally understood the nature of the entity Silas had summoned. It was not simply called to the courthouse. The courthouse became an extension of it. The building was its stomach. The people inside didn't vanish in the sense of being teleported or taken away. They were consumed, digested, absorbed by a being of pure elemental hunger that had momentarily manifested itself as a physical location. "They are not gone," Elias wrote, his pen strokes digging into the paper. "They are here. They are in the wood. They are in the stone. The courthouse is their tomb, and their tomb is the creature. It is a blind god from the hollow earth, and we have built our lives on its skin." After this entry, his writing devolves into a series of frantically drawn spiral symbols, the same sigil found on the judge's bench, repeated over and over until the ink runs out. Elias Vance was found dead in his cabin weeks later, having wasted away from starvation. His eyes, according to those who found him, wide with a terror that death itself could not erase. Thus, the horrifying mystery of the Blackwood Creek Courthouse became a forbidden legend, a ghost story told by the descendants of those who fled, a story that grew more unbelievable with each passing generation. The courthouse itself was never torn down. No one dared. It was left to rot, a skeletal ruin slowly being strangled by the encroaching forest. Locals, what few remained in the surrounding hills, treated the area as poisoned ground. They claimed that the woods around the ruin were unnaturally silent, that no birds sang and no animals left tracks in the soil. They said that on the moonless night of every October 31st, a faint, sickly light could be seen glowing in the empty window frames of the courthouse, and if you were foolish enough to get close, you could hear the faint, spectral echo of a single, piercing scream carried on the wind. The disappearance of 1838 became one of America's most disturbing cold cases, not because it was unsolved, but because the only existing solution was so monstrous, so far outside the bounds of human experience that it was deemed better to be forgotten. It was a history that was deliberately banned, buried under a century of denial and silence. Was Elias Vance's journal the truth, or was it merely the tragic, fantastical ravings of a young man whose mind was broken by a traumatic event? Was he a prophet of a horrifying, supernatural truth, or just the first victim of the courthouse's lingering madness? Perhaps the official story, the one of a flash fire or a mass kidnapping, is the correct one. It is certainly the more comforting one. It allows the world to remain a place of logic and reason, a place where stone buildings do not become living tombs and ancient, hungry gods do not answer the call of their faithful priests. But for those who study the dark, forgotten corners of history, for those who look into the abyss and see something looking back, the story of the Blackwood Creek Courthouse serves as a chilling and potent warning. It is a reminder that the line between folklore and reality can sometimes be horrifyingly thin, and that some cold cases are cold not because the evidence is gone, but because the truth is too terrible to accept. The mystery remains, buried under layers of Virginia soil and redacted history. The town is gone. The records are sealed. The only testament is a forbidden journal and the skeletal ruins of a courthouse that still stands in a silent, watchful forest. The questions linger, hanging in the air like the Appalachian fog. What was the true nature of the entity that Silas Blackwood served? Was it unique to those woods, or is it a part of a darker, unseen world that coexists with our own? And the most unsettling question of all, the one that Silas uttered before the end: the debt is paid. What was this ancient debt? And what other older pacts might still lie dormant, waiting for a new offering, for a new trial, for the day when the final witness is called once more? The story of the Blackwood Creek Courthouse is over, but the horrifying possibility it represents is eternal. That justice is a human concept, and the universe's oldest laws are simply hunger and fear.